Hi everyone, my name is Amy Gillette. I'm Associate Curator here at Woodmere. Thank you so much for coming today to listen to this talk for our exhibition upstairs, which is titled Wild Sight, Thomas Chimes on the Edge of the Rational. Now, and like Marie said, you're going to be welcome to go upstairs after the talk to view it. And also the show's going to be up until October, and so if this afternoon doesn't work for you, you still have plenty of time. And it's a small exhibition as well as a complicated one. So I'm going to do something which I promise I'm going to do just once in this lecture, which is read our exhibition précis to set the stage for what it's all about. So here we go. Wild Sight, Thomas Chimes on the Edge of the Rational. This exhibition traces how Thomas Chimes explored a constellation of figures drawn from myth and literature associated with the unknown and the irrational. Among them are the Greek god Hermes, the swift-footed messenger who moves between worlds, the satyr Pan, a son of Hermes and god of the wilderness, and the Cyclops, whose single eye suggests both limited as well as intensified vision. Chimes also turned to literary figures like Mômo, the alter ego of Antonin Artaud, who was an avant-garde French writer who sought to break through the constraints of rational thought and language. With these subjects and more, Chimes created a dialogue in which ancient myth and modern experimentation converge. Wild Sight becomes both a subject as well as a method, a way of seeing that challenges the boundaries of reason, while opening new possibilities for understanding the self and society. His work confronts what he understood as a void at the center of modern existence, one brought about by the disenchantment of the world, and invites viewers to expand their consciousness and embrace the unsettling insights of Wild Sight. And so when you do see the exhibition, I hope that it helps you see perhaps in some new ways, either the art itself or existence more broadly. Now, something I'd like to underscore is that Chimes was not the first to explore a kind of wild sight beyond what our physical eyeballs can see. The example on the left is incredibly old. It's an icon of Christ Pantocrator at the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai, made in the 6th century during the reign of the Emperor Justinian. Take a look at this icon for a sec. Look at the eyes and tell me, what do you notice about those eyes? What do you see?
One looks perfectly fine, he's looking straight ahead. But the other one has a cast to it, and it's not a happy cast. It's sort of, and it's also not quite looking straight ahead as the other one is, but he's sort of looking over that away a little bit more, maybe wide, but it's a reflective kind of a look.
Yeah.
It's a very disconcerting eyes.
It's disconcerting is a good way to put it, and those are good observations. If you look at this icon of Christ, one eye is engaging you in direct eye contact, the other is looking off, and this is highly purposeful. It tells you what the function of an icon is. You engage it, but by directing your vision and your prayers to it, it connects you with Christ, not in this icon on earth, but actually up in heaven. And so the icon is a way of connecting you via your vision, your physical vision, making it into spiritual vision, so that you're able to pray in direct discourse with Christ in heaven. Do you all follow? And so it's the icon is like laying its operations bare in a way, so that it works for the viewer. And the other one is from the other end of the Middle Ages. It's a manuscript page from an apocalypse from the book of Revelation, where the book of Revelation is narrated by St. John the Evangelist. And in this case, you can see an angel is actually gripping him by the chin, by the beard, and pointing to Christ in a mandorla, saying, look at this visionary realm that's going on in a spiritual realm. Now write about this. And so sight is something that doesn't just happen in one register, like here on earth, with what we physically see, but there can be other modes that are transcendental, that are beyond us. And so we see medieval artists trying to get us to these places. But it's also not, of course, just a medieval thing. You know, I brought in another example from Salvador Dali, The Persistence of Memory, a painting of 1931 that's at Mômo, where Dali is using painting as a way of like excavating into the unconscious or subconscious realms of human experience. And then likewise, I brought in the Beatles' Yellow Submarine from 1968, which, you know, again, talks about the sort of hallucinatory visions that you might access through psychedelic experience. And so we've got all these artists from different periods in art history saying, look, we can use art as a way of accessing these other modes of vision. And Chimes offers another example of what an artist can do. And so I hope to kind of look at his own mode of wild sight in this exhibition, what ingredients went into it, and what he wants his art to do for us as viewers. All right, so here's the artist, Thomas Chimes. His life dates are 1921 to 2009. He was born here in Philadelphia to a family of Greek immigrants, and he was very proud of his Greek heritage, which is part of why the Cyclops was so prominent in his work. His parents, his dad especially, worked in the restaurant business. He was, however, always interested in art. He took art classes as a kid, really shone at West Philadelphia High School, and started when he was a teenager. He enrolled for his undergrad degree at PAFA, actually on the proceeds of $500 that he won in a lawsuit after he had worked in a newsstand and was assaulted at a SEPTA station at 13th and Market. And he didn't come from money, and so that money that he'd gotten from the lawsuit was instrumental for him being able to study art. However, he was short on funds, had a dispute with his teacher, and ended up trying to go help out his dad with the restaurant business. But this was right around 1940-ish. Which is, I can see you registering, this is a critical time in American history, isn't it? And so as all this is happening, Chimes does need to enroll in the military. He goes down south and works as an aircraft mechanic, which he serves as during World War II. And then after World War II ends, he wants to try and re-enroll at PAFA on the GI Bill. But it turns out PAFA was flooded by people trying to do exactly the same at the time. And so instead he moved up to New York City to enroll at the Art Student League. And so there he studied with figures such as Hans Hofmann, who was a famous abstract expressionist. He also went and took philosophy courses at Columbia University with Joseph Margolis, actually, who later became the philosophy chair at Temple University, bringing something else close to home. And Margolis was well known for his aesthetic philosophy. Interestingly, I think, talking about interpretation of art, saying there's never just like one fixed meaning for anything, but meanings can build, accrue over time, which seems to be so salient for Chimes's work, doesn't it? So he does all this and has an exciting time in New York City. Launches his career initially in kind of a classical mode. He is again thinking of his Greek heritage, but gets to learn, of course, about abstraction. But he moves back to Philly in 1953 because he felt restrained by the dynamics of the New York City art world, feeling that you had to be a Jackson Pollock, and those were essentially your options. And Philadelphia seemed much more open. And so, back to the city he comes. And Philly, by the 1960s, I should note, it's not quite a backwater. There was a show at the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Art, where Warhol had one of his blockbuster exhibitions. And so Philly did become a kind of alternative spot for avant-garde art, and a flavor both in terms of the art that you were making, as well as the spirit of like collaboration and openness that you couldn't really get in New York City back then. And so he stayed in Philadelphia for the rest of his career, which went all the way to 2009. And as time passed, his career broke into 4 different phases. The exhibition upstairs concentrates on one, the second of the 1960s, but it does actually get into all of them. And so when we talk today, we will, again, concentrate on his work, the Cyclops, the wild side of the 1960s, but look at other phases too. This was not a planned thing, but a little bit later in his career, Chimes actually read an article about Jackson Pollock that talked about his painting of 1947 called Alchemy, and Chimes said, "Oh, my career has fallen into 4 phases, and those are just like the alchemical phases, which are all about transmuting like matter into something and sublimating it into something higher." And so he really liked that concept. The medieval phases of alchemy, the traditional ones, are black, red, white, and yellow, but Chimes adjusted that a little bit. So he started with his yellow phase, which is the crucifixion paintings of the 1950s to 60s, his metal boxes, which he understood as a red phase, actually. Panel portraits were a black phase. This is the 1970s, and finally his white paintings that started in 1980 and went to the end of his career, and that obviously is the white phase. So let's take a look. Oh, and something else I should note about alchemy. So we mentioned at the beginning, Chimes is so interested in all the possibilities of his Greek heritage, especially the Hermetic traditions, those having to do with like secret, arcane magic. Alchemy was absolutely one of those. Its founding figure was thought to be this guy illustrated on the left. This is an image from the pavement of Siena Cathedral done during the Renaissance. His name was Hermes Trismegistus, meaning thrice great Hermes in Greek. And we noted that alchemy was about transmuting matter, and also the idea that it's not just transmuting matter like lead into gold, for example, but tapping into the secrets of the universe, harnessing them in a way that is like transcendental for the person performing it, and also lets you see some of the secrets of nature. So we're talking about artists as kind of prophetic and visionary, and this on the right is a wonderful illustration from the 19th century of how that can work. It's called, what is this? A medieval traveler peers through an opening in the firmament, meaning like the shell of the cosmos. Can you see him like peeking beyond it into everything that's beyond? And so Chimes is imagining the artist himself as an artist, as an alchemist in this spirit. So let's look then at the first phase of his first like real phase of his mature career, which is this yellow phase, the crucifixion paintings. This is one untitled that he did in the year 1964. It's on view. If you know the space upstairs, it's actually shaped almost like a church. Here's a drawing that's adjacent to this crucifixion painting, and funny enough, almost copies the layout upstairs. So this is the sanctuary of a Byzantine church. This curved bit is called the apse. Upstairs, you'll find this crucifixion painting in the apse, which is so appropriate. This wasn't my idea, but that of Rick Ortwine, who installed it that way. So, kudos to him for that. And what does it, and then inside it, the niche also like just so aptly copies the shape of the apse. So what are we looking at? We've got this, it's a human figure for the most part, with kind of a head going down. It looks almost to me like the stem of a flower, but also perhaps a spinal column. Then we've got this X shape, which is kind of like arms, but also of course an X. Below that we've got, you can see the male anatomy, but also legs in that rectangle. And then the petals around the head, where they're all inscribed with I. And it's almost like, I don't know for sure what's going on, but with the eyes around and that dot, it almost feels like that dot is a cyclopic eye. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. And so I think what this is telling us already is that these images are all multivalent. And the figure is indeed crucified. And then we've got this like reddish and purplish sort of sun, this almost playing card motif down there with this equation A equals X, a sort of torch peacock's tail. So what on earth is going on here? I think one thing that I probably would call out is Chimes was brought up in the Greek Orthodox Church and was fully aware that the central mystery of Christianity, this whole idea that God has a son in Jesus Christ who self-sacrifices and then resurrects for the salvation of humankind, Chimes was well aware all of that is profoundly, fundamentally irrational. And it's not just, that's not a blasphemous thing to say. St. Paul said it. Something along the lines of, I believe not because it makes sense, but because it is absurd. And so it seems Chimes is asking, how can I as a modern artist give shape to this like fundamentally irrational article of faith? And how can I engage like spiritual sight in a sort of modern way? And I think perhaps this rectangle by which we see the legs, or perhaps even that's what seems to be a spinal column, that might be a sort of X-ray vision, as it were, especially because we see those X's repeating everywhere. And so perhaps we're saying the artist has like a penetrating insight into these mysteries. I think that A equals X refers to the mystery of faith. The peacock's tail, that's a symbol of life, of everlasting life, of resurrection, but the peacock's tail is also covered in eyes. And so probably it's also pointing to this kind of like absurd spiritual vision you can get. And then I think it's so neat too, he was explicit that his crucifixion paintings were ideally installed not just in Byzantine churches, but in ruins of Byzantine churches. And I'm trying to wrap my mind around what exactly he meant by that. I think perhaps he wants to be clear to us about the historical background of his paintings, that he's excavating the history of Byzantine art and architecture to bring it to us. It also reminds me a little bit, maybe you've read or heard of Walter Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history, where Benjamin talks about an angel of history who looks behind at history as almost a pile of rubble that we make sense of almost in retrospect. And so perhaps he's referring to something like that. Regardless, this kind of vision for this period of work ideally takes place in Byzantine ruins. And perhaps Chimes didn't have any one answer for us. But in terms of other inspirations he's bringing into the mix, and a really important one for giving shape to sacred art in the modern period is Henri Matisse's Chapel of the Rosary in Vence in France, which he'd really created in gratitude for kindness that the nuns there had shown him during the Second World War. Have any of you been fortunate enough? Oh, you have. Oh my gosh, what was it like?
It's pretty awesome. I mean, it was a long time ago that I went with my husband, but having seen the images in slides and so forth, it was really spectacular being there and being bathed in that color. It was really incredible.
I can only imagine, and it's like extra poignant to see the photos of Matisse as a very old, very frail man, creating this I think the word you use, spectacular, is perfect for it. Spectacular, immersive chapel. I would love to see it someday. But it opened in 1951. Chimes saw it in 1952 when it was really brand new, and he, with his wife, had left. This is shortly before they moved away from New York City. They went on a trip around Europe because Chimes was very open that he himself had suffered episodes of crippling depression that would stymie him, that would cripple him from being able to work. And so they'd made this Europe trip as a way to try and help him out of that. And seeing this chapel in France is something that he'd found transformative, truly moving. And perhaps if we look back briefly at his work, you can see like those wonderful flowers in Matisse's work, the shapes in the stained glass window do come out into his crucifixion paintings. And it's not just Matisse, but a couple other artists too. He was interested in Max Ernst. Here's a work called Seashell at the Philadelphia Museum of Art that Chimes did frequent, that you can probably see makes an almost one-to-one translation for his work up there called Seashells for Breakfast. And it's not just the way it looks, but I've got a wonderful quote here from Ernst. Let's see. It says, he created the contours and textures of the scalloped shell and the wood slats by placing his canvas over different objects and then scraping paint on or off with a palette knife. This process is called grattage, and it was meant to suspend preconceived ideas in the creation of the motif. And so, let's see, Ernst was a member of the Dada circles in Germany, and he related such practice. This is what he said about this. He related the practice of grattage, for like giving the seashells their texture, to the intellect's age-old energetic need to liberate itself from the deceptive and boring paradise of fixed memories, and to investigate new, incomparably expansive areas of experience in which the boundaries between the so-called inner world and the outer world become increasingly blurred. Isn't that wonderful? The deceptive and boring paradise of fixed memories. So Chimes, I'm sure, would have been aware of the intention behind that technique and wanted to appropriate it so that his art too would be able to give access, be able to blur these access between the so-called inner world and outer world by engaging new modes of sight for us. And another artist that did really call to him at this point was Giorgio de Chirico. You can see plenty of his work here in Philadelphia at the Barnes Foundation, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, not to mention at Mômo, for example. And I say that because de Chirico makes X's out of things like cookies from his Ferrara period that look a little bit like the X's Chimes had used to communicate mysteries. Another work that I'll show in a little while, I think, quotes de Chirico's, his mannequins from the Disquieting Muses, but the point of de Chirico was to engage the classical tradition. De Chirico was also proudly of like Greek and Italian heritage, or Italian and then grew up in Greece. For modern purposes, and what de Chirico had wanted to do is use his art to be almost like veils for metaphysical mysteries that might be there if you lift up the cookie or look around the corner of the building. Essentially meaning the things that we physically see are almost like veneers for the big like philosophical mysteries of being, of time, of existence, of identity, and so on. And so Chimes definitely, when he's creating his crucifixion paintings, they're so unique in their way and idiosyncratic for him, but he's building on ideas of these modern artists and pre-modern artists that are in his horizons. Another key one that is for both his crucifixion paintings as well as the phases of his work to come, the metal boxes, etc., is Van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh, but as interpreted through the avant-garde writer Antonin Artaud, who I read to you about at the very beginning of this talk. So, are any of you familiar with Antonin Artaud? Yeah, a little bit. Oh, okay. Yeah.
That was when I was young, and it was just a passing name.
Right, and I saw you a little bit as well, and yeah, before we officially started this talk and started recording, we were talking a bit about just how much reading goes into Thomas Chimes, and Artaud is not somebody that I was familiar with previously, but I did get this book that Chimes had engaged about and Artaud in order to learn more. So Antonin Artaud was active in the early to mid 20th century. He was an avant-garde French poet, playwright, dramatist. He wrote a critical essay, and that's him on the right-hand side, looking very handsome in the filming of Joan of Arc. He wrote in the 1940s, somewhat later than that picture was taken, this essay, Van Gogh, La Suicide, oh gosh, pardon my French, would you like to pronounce Le Suicide de la Société? He was suicided by society.
Le Suicide de la Société.
Oh, thank you. I can say it in my head, but my I'm not quite able to pronounce it. So thank you. And so Artaud's point here was that Van Gogh, who I think it's common knowledge, had himself some profound mental health struggles that ultimately ended his life. But Artaud's argument was that these struggles that Van Gogh had undergone gave him, as an artist, special insight, like special compassion, not just into like human beings around him, but but even the rest of the natural world, like animals, for example, and even things like flowers and fields. And in this essay, this is a phrase that I thought was so poignant: the pure enigma of a tortured sunflower, Artaud described Van Gogh depicting. And you just get the sense of the sort of empathy that the artist had with sunflowers, for example. And when I look at these sunflowers, these are the ones at the National Gallery in London. They look almost like people, don't you? Where the pathos of these like dying sunflowers in the vase is like so much at the picture surface. And so Artaud helped Chimes become interested in Van Gogh as a painter to emulate. You know, this is his yellow phase after all, and it got its tone from Van Gogh. But what was also critical was this idea that an artist who struggles with mental health, it doesn't necessarily have to be a complete impediment, but mental health struggles can be part of what lends themselves to the artist's wild side, as it were. And so it helps Chimes see his own episodes of depression, of confronting like the inner void inside him as a potential wellspring of creativity, instead of something that's just gonna like exit out. And Artaud also was speaking from a place of deep personal experience. By the time he was writing this Van Gogh essay, he spent a lot of his time, a lot of his life in mental health institutions and jail, and had just been subjected to, over the course of a year plus, something like 51 unanesthetized electroshock treatments, right, which is crazy. I can't even imagine, and it like broke his body, broke his psyche. And this is the experience that gave birth to the figure I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Mômo, who rose out of the ashes of that experience for Artaud. So anyway, to kind of sum up these crucifixion paintings, what we've got going on is he's bringing together Matisse, de Chirico, Van Gogh as interpreted by Artaud. Another source that was very important to him is the book that was published pretty recently. I could be, please don't quote me on this, I think the publication date was something like 1959 for Kazantzakis's Last Temptation of Christ. But this is something that Chimes had been interested in because it's a Greek author, and he might have read it originally in Greek before it was translated to English. But in this, Christ is presented as a like fully human being who faces temptations and ultimately goes through with his sacrifice. And Chimes kind of saw in that an artist figure again. So I just wanted to put that out there to, I suppose, be comprehensive with our bibliography. But we were talking as well about how the figure in the niche, the crucified figure, looks a lot like a flower, and that may have something to do with Van Gogh's like tortured sunflower, but it may have to do too with the wild sight that Chimes was exploring with his Cyclops figures pretty much the next year. So let's take a look then about how those come about. Now, so this crucifixion painting is 1964. He continues to work on them, but 1965 was an interesting year because through his brother who lived in New York City, Chimes met this author, Bettina Knapp, who commissioned him to make the cover for this book, Symbolum Mundi. It was a Renaissance era book written in the 16th century by Bonaventure de Perrier. That French name is a little bit easier to say, I think. And it too is a Hermetic text, very arcane, full of alchemy. It's satirical, full of poking fun at authority, and so many of these things do appeal to Thomas Chimes. And if you look at the center, we've got Symbolum Mundi. It talks essentially about the structure of the world. At the center is a little bird figure, and that seems to have to do with some passages in this book where there are birds like, I think it's magpies that can recite the entirety of the Iliad, some other kind of birds that know all of philosophy's precepts, like they can talk all about Aristotle and more. And so we've got wisdom arriving from a sort of unexpected source. And it's at this time that Chimes starts to really know Artaud and starts to make Artaud inspired drawings, both relating to crucifixions and otherwise. So he also did the book cover for the same author for her landmark study called Antonin Artaud, Man of Vision. It was commissioned the same year in 1965 that you can see, and finally published in 1969. And here's the book. So if you'd like, let me actually pass this around so you can check it out if you like. So so here we start to see Chimes thinking through his Artaud imagery. We can see maybe we've got the heart over his heart, some X's in there that refer perhaps to mysteries. But then here are his images that you'll see in the apse alongside the crucifixion painting upstairs that starts to be, I think, more directed in terms of how he's thinking about Artaud and how to depict him. So on the left is a work called Artaud the Magician. And when I saw this initially, I thought, oh, maybe this is an angel. Because of course it's, you know, a figure with wings. It's coming straight out of his crucifixion paintings. And so perhaps thinking about an angel makes sense in the context of his like sacred art sort of phase. But then when you go, especially when you go upstairs, check out how the wings seem to be sewn on instead. We've got all these dotted lines, and so the wings don't seem to be, I suppose, attached in the way that you might think of with angels. Although, like, to be fair, I'm pausing because, of course, angels are supposed to be entirely bodiless, entirely immaterial, and so we depict them with wings really as a matter of convention. But it made me think, maybe Chimes is thinking about the Greek myth, actually, of Daedalus and Icarus. Do you all know who those figures are? Yeah, Daedalus was an inventor. He was the one that had made statues that could move and talk like automata. He'd made the labyrinth. He was also famous when he was imprisoned with his son Icarus for fashioning wings so that they could escape from prison by flying away, made out of feathers and wax. And his son Icarus sadly had gotten overexcited and flew too close to the sun. The wax in his wings melted, and sadly he drowned. He drowned in the Aegean Sea. And I think that this is actually going on with Artaud the Magician. Magician is a great word to describe Daedalus. And you might be able to think of him either as Daedalus, who'd fashioned the wings and created all of this sorts of art, but maybe he's also Icarus. Somebody who took it too far and suffered the consequences, because something that I think we do see Chimes playing with this idea of wild sight is it can help you like peer beyond the firmament, have all of these insights, whether it's alchemically based or coming from this place of confronting the void, but it's dangerous too, and he wants to show us that, and who better to show it through than the figure of Artaud. And again, Mômo was the figure that was born out of the like shattering of his psyche with all of those electroshock treatments. And I should have said that Artaud had given birth to this figure in a poem called Le Mômo, where he tries to like break apart language to these series of screams and like guttural noises and like bodily references to try and like push language beyond the constraints of the rational to better show like the full extent of human experience. Does that sound about right as a former French teacher? It's a very hard poem to read and listen to, as it absolutely should be. These are hard ideas that Chimes is trying to give us, and so now we've got Artaud and Mômo have entered the room, and then a little right around this time, Chimes launches his series, what he calls his red alchemical phase of the metal box constructions. And this here is much of the heart of the exhibition. And here are a number of them. None of these are actually in the exhibition upstairs, but But he created many of them. Oh, and this is something that's very interesting, is he fabricated all of these in his own garage in Philadelphia using techniques that he had learned during the Second World War as an aircraft mechanic. And so I suppose you never quite know when some experience is going to come in handy for like future work. And these metal boxes, some of them are like reliquaries, or the containers to hold sacred relics that he would have been, again, well aware of from his Greek Orthodox upbringing. And this one over here on the left-hand side, untitled, in parentheses, crucifix, is certainly leaning into that idea. Yes, up here, probably the first one in the series, I should say, that he'd made almost incidentally in 1965. Mômo, the figure of Mômo that you see in the circle there with the kind of bird profile that again plays with the birds in the Symbolum Mundi, as well as Artaud's own figure. Mômo and his ideas about the body, about rationality, are pivotal for the machines. And the one below it is called Mômo Talk. That one no longer exists at all, because when Chimes was done with his metal boxes and wanted to move on, he destroyed it in what he described as a ritual act with a chainsaw. So no more Mômo Talk for us. And then he also made a lot of inserts, and I suspect and think, but I don't know for sure, that many of the drawings upstairs were created either as studies or as inserts for these metal boxes. And then the one on the right is called Geometry Love, and you can see what that is. And there's a lot of thoughts about like the body and eroticism that Chimes brings to bear in these metal boxes. This is part of why he calls it his red phase of his alchemical production, is because there's this like hot like eroticism that was prominent within it. So let's look at how that breaks down. We've got one metal box upstairs, which is in Woodmere's collection. It's called multiplex. And that refers to, let me see if I can get this right. Multiplex refers to transmitting information over multiple screens. So if we look at that, there are, 4 different registers. This is also the only work that Chimes made multiples of. He made a series of 100 that was intended for an exhibition that explored the idea of multiplicity. And he didn't quite like the way it worked out, so it's the only time that he did it. But the title multiplex refers to that as well, which is sort of perfect for thinking about, say, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And then it's full of all these complicated drawings that I think are pseudo-rational, where they will play with ideas of, say, goodness, I don't even know, optics, sound effects, aviation technology, without actually saying anything sensible or rational in the end. This one does have a few inscriptions that kind of tells you what he's thinking, although again, not with any definite conclusion. So what have we got? You can see on the screen, it does say Eros. And then next to that is Champ, C-H-A-M-P, comma, du, D-U. And let's see, optimum, we've got multiplex trough. And here, I think the Eros and Champ, comma, du is probably the interpretive key. Duchamp refers to Marcel Duchamp, who among Chimes's artists was one of his main reference. In an interesting way as well. So Duchamp was a highly conceptual artist. So much of his work is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Duchamp, like Chimes, was very interested in literature, and also said something that Chimes really picked up on, which is that a good artist should take his inspiration, take his, her, their inspiration more from literature than from other artists, which is why Chimes comes with such a stack of reading. But this idea of eroticism in the machine, I think Chimes also borrowed quite heavily from Duchamp. Over on the right hand of the screen, we see one of Duchamp's most famous works called The Large Glass at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And kind of image that you see in the bottom, that like drum-looking thing with the cones rotating in the propeller-like thing around, and then that contraption to the left of it. He called that a chocolate grinder. The chocolate grinder was an allusion to, well, male masturbation, actually. And so Duchamp was associating machinery with eros, and Chimes wants us to know that he's picked up on this idea in a way that's, I think, kind of interesting, kind of positive. Artaud also talked a lot about the body, about sexuality, and Mômo shows up so much in the machines that I think Chimes is alerting us that he's thinking about Mômo too, maybe as a way. And Artaud was very suspicious about the body, but also understood it as a way of breaking beyond rationality. And so perhaps the idea of a machinery as like imitating like certain motions, plus Artaud's idea about breaking beyond the constraints of rationality are probably what he's bringing together in these particular machines. Does that make sense? It is complicated, isn't it? And then there's more, believe it or not. Another thing that was key for Chimes, not quite at the outbreak of the machines, but starting in 1966, there was a lecture here in Philly at the ICA by the philosopher Marshall McLuhan, who looked at technology and society. You might be able to see on all of these TV screens behind him a phrase that's familiar to us now: the medium is the message. How would you describe the meaning of that? Yeah.
It's all about the medium.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah, I guess enough said, right? I think the gist of it is it doesn't matter what's on TV or what's on the radio, what content there is, but the fact that everybody is watching TV at 7 p.m. Or listening to their radios or whatnot, or we can apply it today, can't we? Thinking about newer technologies like the internet. These technologies have fundamentally reshaped society. That's his point. Another phrase he was responsible for was the global village, where we're all connected in ways that we've never been before. And gosh, that becomes more and more true, even as it sort of, I guess, reshapes the meaning as we're all used to not like mass media, but social media, AI and more. And so McLuhan talks about these ideas as mass media is becoming so prominent in the US. He was from Canada and elsewhere, but he had really interesting things to say about the artist. I've got two quotes from him here. One, he says, "The artist is always engaged in writing a detailed history of the future because he is the only person aware of the nature of the present." And again, McLuhan uses the pronoun he, but I think today we can certainly expand that to whoever. And then below that, the job of the artist is to upset all the senses and thus provide new vision and new powers of adjusting to and relating to new situations. So can you see how these ideas would be appealing to Chimes? What McLuhan here is saying is a kind of another way of looking at the kind of ideas about the artist's vision he's already been playing with. If we're looking at trying to penetrate the mysteries of faith or use the inner experience of mental health to look at the world, whether people or the natural world around us in new ways. This idea that the artist is the only person that's like really able to see through technology to understand its impact on the world and how to get beyond it and thus write the history of the future. Chimes seems to run with it in these metal box constructions. And so the metal box constructions from this point seem to talk about the society in the thrall of technology and how to get past it. So this is where some of these interesting figures come in. Perhaps one of the showstoppers is this one on the left. Its official title is Untitled, parentheses, phallic head. Chimes, when I was reading the catalog from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, referred to it as self-portrait as dickhead. So, you really kind of need to give him props to him for his sense of humor that I think comes out so beautifully in some of these images, especially with that almost like grave expression that he's wearing in here. One of my favorite parts about this, and this is something like with these graphs, that parabola that kind of nicely echoes the contour of the phallus in there, the grids that like F1, F2 down there. This suggests it's either supposed to be like an insert of or a study for some of the metal boxes. But if you check out, there's the tip and shaft, the upper shaft are sort of like a hat, but look right below the tip. There are eye holes, almost as if he's able to pull it down like a mask to see through the lens of the erect phallus, through the lens of eroticism, as it were. And I think here he's saying, like, the artist literally has penetrating vision, as it were, into like society, technology, etc. And then in the middle here, it's also a self-portrait, in this case as Pan. Like we mentioned at the beginning, Pan is the god of wild nature, also, according to Greek mythology, a son of Hermes, so he's got access to the Hermetic tradition, but I think it belongs really more in the wild, untamed, kind of erotic aspect of experience that Chimes wants to, bring to bear on the way we're looking at society. And then finally, I brought in the photograph on the right-hand side of him around this time. Oh, actually, here's another book that you can pass around. I took the photograph from here. It's all about his metal boxes. But when his son Dimitri actually said that he remembered what went on in this portrait, in here, do you see, if you can see that circular thing, Chimes is holding up a lens to look through. And so in a way, it's almost as if he's looking through the lens of the machine or through a glass darkly. And so how perfect for this idea of what the artist's vision can do in the age of technology. And then, here we come to our Cyclops imagery once again. And there are many of them. These also are self-portraits. For the most part, I can say, there's Chimes's face again so that we can compare them. In some of them, his eyes are closed. In the middle one, it almost looks as if his normal eyes are stitched shut, so that he can direct his sight to the eye in the forehead, this more visionary register. The one on the right, I think, is kind of interesting because it's in this keystone shape with those screws that you can see on either side of the aperture, suggesting perhaps that the Cyclops is supposed to be looking at us through one of the metal boxes. And so, again, these are about the different powerful, potentially dangerous kind of sight that an artist can bring, that can counter machines, that can bring us to new visions of society. Oh, and another point of interest, they're mostly self-portraits. I wanted to bring in this comparison. You can probably guess why, and I hear you chuckle. All right, let's look at what we've going on here. Those of you who are docents are probably familiar with this image, right? This is, it's another work that's untitled, but parenthetically, Greta Garbo. It dates to 1967. It's in the room next door. Exactly. And this is a fascinating work of art because it's kind of a metal box construction, except a bit more of like a reliquary, more of an icon for the pop icon Greta Garbo. And I should note too that during the 1960s, Chimes is also well aware of Andy Warhol, who'd also spoken at the ICA in addition to Marshall McLuhan. But she has the same haircut as the Cyclops in this drawing for a metal box construction. And so I do not know what to make of that, other than we've got Chimes kind of almost like shuffling his deck of references, and asking us to like cross-fertilize how we're supposed to interpret any one of these. But let's look at these Cyclops again. If you look below this one, you might be able to see the word perigee. It's also below that one in the middle. It shows up one more time in another drawing upstairs. And so clearly this is a word that was really important, and it's only in Cyclops drawings. Do any of you know what perigee means?
Isn't it an aeronautical term?
Yes. Here's a nice diagram for you. So it refers, among other things, to the lunar orbit. It doesn't have to be the lunar orbit, but I think that's what Chimes is referring to here. So it's the opposite of apogee. So apogee describes like when the moon is farther away from the Earth, it looks smaller. Perigee is when the moon is closest to Earth in its orbit, and it causes like rising tides as well as all of these myths of madness in a way, like the kind of idea that people are a little bit out of sorts when you've got like a big full moon. And I think that this is what Chimes is trying to direct our attention to. Is he seems, I think, to be bringing together the idea of the Cyclops' big eye with the moon, but the moon closest to Earth at its orbit when it looks biggest to us and makes everybody a little bit crazy. And so I think he's saying that this vision is almost like a lunatic mode of seeing. And perhaps that's a bit of a play on the idea of that he'd gotten from Artaud, that he's playing a little bit with madness. But again, whether or not that's the case, we have this idea that of sight that is in fact wild and perhaps even untamable, even as it offers solutions to the extra rational technology that we're all subject to these days. So perhaps it's a release. And then, thinking about some of the rewards and pitfalls of this kind of wild sight, there are slightly different versions of Cyclops that are not self-portraits because their entire head is one big eye. But like the construction of the metal boxes themselves, these do seem to refer to Chimes's aviation career during the Second World War. They seem to kind of mimic like what do you call them? The things that you see through in a bomber that he worked on in order to direct your targets. There's a particular technical term that must be in the green book that you're looking at, but I think you all know what I mean, right? Yes?
He's supposed to be looking at a bomb site, but he's looking up and out into the air. I thought people looking at bomb sites were looking.
Well, yeah, that is true. You're talking about the photograph that I've got from Life magazine here. I don't know how this photograph might have been constructed, but yes, I think that this is not just bringing the Cyclops into the realm of technology, but and showing us that this vision has a side of it that can potentially be dangerous. But I think it has something a little bit to do with the Odyssey as well, which I think with the recent film release, probably people are going to be brushing up on. But the Cyclops in the Odyssey is called Polyphemus. He's one of the main antagonists of the hero Odysseus in that journey. Odysseus kind of breaks into his cave. The Cyclops eats his men. Odysseus and his men figure out how to blind him and escape. So the poor Cyclops, with a big burning tree trunk they drove into his eyeball. When Odysseus escapes, he can't help himself but taunt the Cyclops as the ships are fleeing. And at that point, Polyphemus, the wounded, blinded Cyclops, gets boulders and hurls them at Odysseus's fleeing ships as they go away, taking out, I think, a couple of them. It's been a little while since I read the Odyssey, but I think that in the case of making these Cyclops look a bit like bombers, that might be a bit of a reference to the boulders that Polyphemus was hurling at them like bombs as they fled, perhaps. And so, with all of these, we've got Chimes playing with a whole cornucopia of ideas that we've gone over, again, all talking about the artist's power via vision. And Chimes has worked through all of these ideas with the metal box constructions, but by 1973, he feels like it's time to move on to something else. And he begins this new series of panel portraits, of which we've got one study upstairs, Edgar Allan Poe. And I do want to bring it in because it's really important as a pivotal moment into the big series of white paintings that he does all the way till the end of his career. So he's reading Thomas Artaud. There's another book that he discovers, a little bit connected to Artaud, because Artaud was a champion of another French author, philosopher, playwright, novelist called Alfred Jarry. And this is a book that Chimes discovered when I think he was helping his brother-in-law move. And so a connection again, I should say, to Artaud. It's called What is Pataphysics? Has anybody heard of pataphysics before?
Who is the author again?
So this is a copy, I promise I'll answer your question. So this is a copy of the Evergreen Review in 1960 that's all about pataphysics. The person who'd invented pataphysics is called Alfred Jarry. And so he was a French author, another French avant-garde writer, creator, active mostly at the start of the 20th century. And let me pass this around as well. It's got, and the photo on the cover of the book becomes important to Chimes. So pataphysics. Oh, and when I gave this talk the first time, I thought I had never heard of pataphysics, but then somebody who attended it said, what is it, the Beatles song, Maxwell's Silver Hammer? Joan was quizzical, something about science pataphysical. So maybe you have heard of it. Anyway, it's an invented science. It has to do, Jarry described, he described in terms of, there's physics, which describes like the nature of the physical universe, and then metaphysics, which describes kind of the meanings beyond that. He said that metaphysics is to physics, pataphysics is to metaphysics, an imaginary science that invents imaginary solutions to imaginary problems, but is all about expanding the realm of the possible, essentially, into new realms, which is something that appealed hugely to Chimes, who is all about, trying to find new worlds that art can share with people. And so this is important. This is important for the panel portraits, which he does. We've got Edgar Allan Poe, who was a one-time Philadelphian, and so it's lucky for us that this is the one in the show. He creates a whole universe in his portraits of all of these thinkers. We've got Jarry in the top left there, Poe himself. There's another Jarry, Robert Louis Stevenson, Aubrey Beardsley, Lord Kelvin, Guillaume Apollinaire, Antonin Artaud is down there, James Joyce. We've got Paul Verlaine, Rose de la Vie, which is Duchamp's alter ego. There's André Breton as the glove. And so these are all thinkers that thought like a little bit out of left field. And so Chimes constructs like a pantheon of them for thinkers to inhabit this realm of sort of alternative thought that gets us beyond our day-to-day. And the inspiration for this was a book that Jarry had written called Dr. Faustrel, Pataphysician, which is wonderful. It itself is a kind of odyssey. Dr. Faustrel is the protagonist. He undertakes a journey from Paris to Paris by sea. And if that title rings a bell, it's because that's the title of the white painting in our collection that's displayed next to Greta Garbo in the next gallery to us. And so his boat is a sieve. They use oars, they travel over land, and they visit, almost like in the Odyssey, all these different fantastical realms, each of which is inhabited by a different thinker and operates according to the laws of that particular thinker. And one of the best parts is that in it, Dr. Faustrel actually dies, but that's not the end of it. He still, like after death, is writing a series of messages to Lord Kelvin, who's down there somewhere. And he's wrapped up in, as a funeral shroud in wallpaper created by the symbolist artist Maurice Denis, who's in here somewhere. But when the wallpaper unfurls, out of the scrolls come the secrets of the universe. And so it takes place in this, in this pataphysical realm where everything operates according to slightly different laws. But it's an alternative space where these fascinating new offbeat thoughts are what hold sway. And so another, realm of wild sight for us. And then I realize this is, relatively brief, but Jerry, this series, Jerry was also instrumental to the birth of the white paintings. That's a photograph of him taken in France, Corbeil, France, I think it is. I think the date of the photo is 1898. It's also the cover of the book that's going around of him riding the bike. Chimes recreates it. Oh, and here's the, what is it? Deeds and Opinions of Dr. Fausto, Pataphysician. That's the title of the book. There he is. Chimes did a version of the photograph, but you can see he took the wheels off of Jerry's bike, so it's almost like his skiff from which he sailed overland from Paris to Paris by sea. He kind of puts also this French street into this gray, misty shroud, and that becomes prominent in our final phase of paintings, his white paintings, which launch in the year 1980. And this is something else that has kind of a fascinating and a little bit of a sad story where Chimes separated from his wife and moved into a new studio in Philly that had formerly been occupied by the artist Tom Palmore. Did any of you see the big portrait of the gorilla when you came in? Yeah, that is a work by Tom Palmore. And so Chimes gets his studio in the year 1980. One thing he inherits is a big canvas that's already been primed with gesso, like the plaster that you put on it so you can paint on it. The gesso's white. Chimes is also, he's devastated about his separation from his wife. He's also feeling like he's gotten to the end of his panel portraits, but what does he do now? And the way the story goes, at least according to the PMA catalog from 2007, from his big retrospective there, is that one night in 1980, he drank a prodigious amount of wine. I think it said something like a gallon, if that's possible. And just started coating this big white gesso canvas with layers and layers of ultramarine blue. And eventually he said he started to see a horizon line come out of this almost blue mist. And what that reminded him of was his trip to Niagara Falls that he'd taken with his wife around 1950 when they were newlyweds. And so he sobered up, and this inspired him. And he dug up this vintage postcard from about 1950 and paints a scene of Niagara Falls, where you can see the falls. This is a work that we've got upstairs, I should say, where you can see he's taken the actual postcard, but then made all of these diagrams of it. There's a Fibonacci spiral in it and a series of ellipses. He was trying to figure out the optics of how rainbows happen, and then took it, ran with it, created Niagara Falls paintings. This one you're able to see over at Smith Hall in our Arc of Promise exhibition. And I'll share something sort of fun. This is a photograph I took yesterday. I was with a friend in Margate, New Jersey. It's a big storm, one of the most beautiful rainbows I've ever seen. So over there in Atlantic City, and then going into the sea over there. And I was talking with my friend, we were trying to figure out what does this rainbow look like for the people over there in Atlantic City. And what is objective about the optical experience of rainbows, how much of it is subjective, based on where you're standing and viewing rainbows. And I said, oh my goodness, this is life imitating art. This is what Chimes was trying to do. He's making these diagrams to sort out the scientific optics of it, but all of these paintings are like these personal odysseys of, you know, him trying to find his path in art, and after he's done with his panel portraits and after his wife has left, what does he do now? And so it truly is like bringing together like the objective, but trying to sort out like what's subjective and unique within that. And so it was so fun to kind of see like a real life Chimes experience in this like rainbow in Margate. And so the exhibition ends with a few white paintings. This is an interesting one. It's called Chaos 3, done in the year 1994. And so what it seems to be is a cosmogram, meaning a diagram of the cosmos. I brought in one that seemed relevant enough. This is at the Camposanto in Pisa, done at the end of the 1300s. You've got the figure of God at the top, who's you know, created heaven and earth, as it were. And then in the middle, you've got like the earth and the zodiac and the different hierarchies of angels. It's called Chaos because I believe because some ancient Greek thinkers like Hesiod, for example, that Chimes was interested in like throughout his career for looking at the, say, Greek mythology, Greek literature. Hesiod, among others, described the void as being like the starting point in the center of the cosmos. So that goes into the cosmogram. It also plays into this idea of microcosm, macrocosm, where of course Chimes seems to be talking about this like void at the center of the self that people like Artaud had grappled with as a source of like sight and creativity, the way that the void at the center of the cosmos was really the kind of the kernel of creation of it. And then if you start to look in there, what are other things we see? Some modern things like what seem to be DNA helices, which again seem to speak to this idea of void and creativity. Steam pipes, and then do you see the figure of Jerry with his pork pie hat, like from his bike coming in? And so this seems to be doing a couple of things. First, Chimes suspected that as he aged, he himself started to resemble Alfred Jarry, as well as Jarry's creation Ubu Ra, which is upstairs. I won't get into that right now. But thinking about the pantheon of pataphysical thinkers he'd created, Chimes seems to be suggesting like pataphysics and the ideas of creatively expanding the universe as a sort of antidote to falling into the void that an artist can create for us by showing us other ways of seeing and thinking and existing. And then that comes out too in this painting called Anna Livia Pluribel, which again, credit to Rick, he displayed up in the light well, and so it becomes so like airy and lofty. It's almost entirely white with thick white washes of paint that you can almost see the dimensionality of them with this like faint rise in the center. It feels very like foggy, watery. I also, and the reference is, in the title is to Finnegan's Wake. I don't really know why I brought this, but I'll pass it around as well. So Anna Livia Pluribel is a character, and so at this point too, to clarify, Chimes starts really to integrate James Joyce into his panoply of intellectual heroes. Unfortunately for me, his favorite Joyce book seems to have been Finnegan's Wake, which is not easy reading. And I actually signed up for a course at the Rosenbach to try and wrap my mind better around it in the future. Anna Livia Pluribel is a character in it, like I said, not a conventional one, but she's more of a figure of the river Liffey. And ultimately, in the book, just kind of like dissolves her being, language dissolves. And I've got down here a quote, the last one, away alone, alas the loved along the. This is the last line of Finnegan's Wake, which doesn't make too much sense unless you think about it as the dissolution of language itself, which might sort of hark back to some ideas of Artaud of like dismembering the body and language to try and get to like deeper sorts of truths. And the whiteness in these also seems to have been a reference to another Joyce book. This is a much earlier one of his, The Dead and Dubliners. which quotes a newspaper line like "Snow is general across Ireland." And so they're like veiled, shrouded in snow, and it really does feel like in order to get to these meanings, we've got to make our way almost like an Odysseus through the snow to try and get through these many layers of white. But what could be at the end? Like, who's even to say? There's a fundamental mystery to it, and that comes, I think, comes out perhaps most overtly in the last painting in the sequence of the exhibition. This one is called Hecate Hermes, and it seemed like a really good place to end because it gets back to Greek mythology and literature. We've got Hermes again, the Greek messenger, the swift-footed messenger. Hecate was a lot like him. She's a god of thresholds, of in-between spaces. Here's a vase that shows her at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There she is with the bamboo batons alongside Hermes, actually guiding Persephone out of the underworld back to her mother Demeter for the 6 months of like spring and summer before she has to go back to Hades. Psychopomp means a guide for the souls. Both like Hermes, Hecate are gods of like gates and again of like as messengers of getting from here to there. And these are all of the liminal places where Chimes really did try to access his visionary modes. His ideas about like alchemy and transmutation and peering beyond the firmament. He doesn't make it easy for the viewer. He did use the inscriptions in his white paintings. If you have good eyesight, if you can read Greek, you might be able to look at these and see the names Hermes. Perhaps I don't think my pointer actually works, but that's kind of toward the upper left. Hecate is kind of toward the bottom right. Something else fun that he did at this time is, for the most part, with his inscriptions, he would just leave the dots of the eyes and sort of erase everything else in layers of white. And so, there's a meaning there, but it might not be ultimately accessible as we're, I guess, excavating all of these white paintings to get to the kinds of alternate universes that he's describing with his ideas about vision and thought. And I think that this quote here that he produced toward the end of his life about his white paintings is such a perfect place to end. He said, "For me, the white surfaces of these canvases strongly suggest emerging consciousness. What lies hidden and mysterious in the metal boxes and portrait panels seems to show forth in the whiteness. And yet the white explains nothing, but simply points to the mystery, as if to say, there it is. There is something profoundly dark about such mystery, and yet at the same time full of light." So isn't that an absolutely beautiful quote of his, where it does show us that these white paintings have everything that's present in his earlier thought. We've got the sacred mysteries, we've got the Greek myth, we've got alchemy, we have, oh boy, let's see, the Odyssey shows up in them almost in the way of our Odyssey through the whiteness. And then we've got Alfred Jarry and James Joyce. And so it really is all there, but there's no answer, is there? I think that perhaps that's part of the wildness of wild sight. And so when you do go up and see the exhibition, I hope that this was helpful. And I just want to thank you so much for your presence and sharing your thoughts today. So thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate that you're here. All right, thank you. Yeah.